Before continuing, I want to pause for a moment. If you're listening and feel your heart grow heavy, if you've ever stayed silent just because you were afraid of your family falling apart, then you may understand me. I'm not telling this to blame anyone, only to say that you are not alone when you feel forgotten within your own family. At our age, many people still believe that if they endure a little more, everything will be fine. Being a parent means having to give up more and suffer more. If stories like this touch you, stay here with me. And if you'd like to hear more honest, gentle family stories like this, you can subscribe to the channel so we don't have to face these things alone. Because stories like this happen more often than we think. 3 months before that morning, my life moved along at a steady pace. I had been living alone in this house since my husband passed away. It wasn't noisy, but it wasn't too empty either. In the mornings, I would go to the nearby market and recognize a few familiar vendors. In the afternoons, I watered the potted plants on the porch. In the evenings, I ate dinner by myself and turned on the TV just to have some human voices around. Sometimes I talked to myself, not because I was unbearably lonely, but because I had grown used to it. I was used to asking myself what to eat that day, whether it was cold outside, and whether I should go to bed a little earlier. I wasn't happy, but I was okay. That afternoon, my son called. "Mom, I need to talk to you. It's urgent." His voice sounded tired, trailing off at the end. I asked what was wrong, but he only said he'd come over right away. About 2 hours later, he arrived. He wasn't alone. My daughter-in-law followed behind him, and the 2 kids dragged along a few suitcases. They said they had lost their place to stay. Work wasn't going well, and they needed a temporary place to live. They said they would stay for just a few months. Once things got better, they would leave. I hesitated. I really did. But when the younger child looked at me and softly said, "Grandma," I nodded. I thought, family helps family. And I didn't know that from that moment on, my sense of peace had begun to change. In the early days, I still believed everything would be fine. We ate together as a family and had a conversation. I cooked. My daughter-in-law helped a little. The kids ran around and laughter returned to the house. I told myself that having more people around for a while wasn't such a bad thing. However, small changes began to appear. Very small. So small that if you didn't pay attention, you'd think they were just normal. One morning, I noticed that my favorite chair in the living room had been moved to a corner. My daughter-in-law said, "I rearranged things to make it neater, Mom." The next day, the coffee table was turned a different way. A few boxes of my old belongings were neatly stacked in the garage. She smiled and said, "You haven't used these in a long time, Mom. Putting them out here makes more space." I nodded. It sounded reasonable. Those phrases began to repeat every day. "Let me do it for you." "You're older now. You shouldn't do that." "That's too heavy. Don't touch it." At first, I felt cared for. Then I began to feel myself standing outside of things that used to be mine. Once I was about to cook a familiar soup. My daughter-in-law looked into the pot and said gently but firmly, "That dish has too much oil. It's not good for you. I'll make something else." I stood there for a moment, then stepped back. Not because I didn't know how to cook, but because I didn't want to argue. Gradually, I found myself asking for permission before doing things in my own home. "Do you need the kitchen right now? Is it okay if I hang the laundry here?" Each time, I smiled to myself and then felt a quiet sadness, but I didn't say anything. I was afraid of being seen as difficult, as an older adult who nitpicks too much. Some nights, lying in my room, I asked myself, am I really that picky? Should I be more easygoing so my children can feel comfortable? My son saw everything, but he only brushed it off with a few words. "Come on, Mom, when a house is full of people, you have to be a little flexible." He didn't take anyone's side, and that very silence made it harder for me to speak up. Little by little, the familiar house began to change. Not because the furniture changed so much, but because I no longer felt like it belonged to me. I was still there, but I began to live more quietly, speak less, and walk more carefully in my own home. It truly hit me one late afternoon. That day, I came back from the market, grocery bag still in my hand, and slowed my steps in front of the living room. On the wooden shelf against the wall, where I had placed my husband's photo for years, there was nothing. In its place were a few scented candles and a small potted plant. I stood there for a long time. Then I asked my daughter-in-law, trying to keep my voice normal, "Where is his photo, dear?" She answered quickly, as if she had prepared the reply, "I put it in the cabinet to tidy things up. Having too many photos like that just makes the place feel sad." That night, after everyone had gone to their rooms, I opened the cabinet. Inside was a large box. I lifted the lid, and one by one, the items came into view before me. An old watch. Several letters were yellowed with age, a handkerchief worn at the edges. I touched each one, as if touching memories. I remembered my husband's voice when he was still alive. He used to say, "Don't throw these things away. Keep them, just in case you miss them." Back then, I laughed and told him he worried too much. Now I understand. I kept searching. Some things were still there. Some were gone. I didn't ask right away. I was afraid of the answer. A few days later, I looked for the old music records, the ones he used to play on Sunday afternoons. I searched the whole house. My daughter-in-law said the cleaning crew had thrown them away because they were too old to listen to anymore. That night, I sat alone in the living room for a long time. No music, no familiar sounds. I felt the house was quieter than it needed to be. I asked my son about it. He stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame. I could see he wanted to say something. His mouth opened, then closed. "Mom," he finally said, his voice low, "you should live in the present." He turned away immediately after that. That night, I took out a photo of my husband. I placed it on the table and sat there for a long time. I spoke softly as if to him, "I don't want to make the children unhappy." Then I put the photo back into the box. Not because I had forgotten him, but I was afraid of putting my son in an uncomfortable position. From that day on, I quietly opened each box of belongings. Some boxes I kept, some I closed and left untouched. Each time, my heart hurt a little, but I said nothing. I told myself they were just objects. The memories were still inside me, but deep down, I knew that a part of those memories was being taken away, and I was silently allowing it to happen. I was hurting, but I was more afraid of hurting my child. The sale of the family heirloom happened not long after. One afternoon, I overheard my daughter-in-law talking on the phone in the dining room. Her voice was low, but I immediately recognized familiar words: price, condition, quick transaction. When I stepped closer, the computer screen was open, displaying images of the old wooden cabinet and its contents, the items my husband had carefully preserved for decades. I asked, my voice no longer steady, "What are you doing?" She turned around, completely unfazed. "I'm selling that set, Mom." I immediately said no. I said it was something my husband had left behind. It was a memory of an entire lifetime. My daughter-in-law sighed, then spoke slowly, each word carefully chosen. "If you really care about us, you'll understand. The whole family is struggling. Keeping those things doesn't help anyone." My son stood beside her. He was silent for a few seconds, then said, "You're always clinging to the past, Mom. What's the point of keeping all that stuff?" I looked at him, trying to find the eyes of the little boy he used to be. But all I saw was a tired man who wanted everything neat and resolved quickly. I explained. I said it wasn't just furniture, it was a memory, a lifetime of effort. But the more I spoke, the more I felt like someone making excuses. My daughter-in-law shook her head. "Just think about us for once. Don't be so selfish." The word selfish fell very lightly, but it weighed heavily on my heart. That night, I lay awake, tossing and turning. I asked myself whether I was truly wrong. Was I making things hard for my children over a few old belongings? Had I been living too much in the past and forgotten the present? At this age, people are terrified of being labeled, afraid of being called stubborn, afraid of being told they don't know how to think about their children and grandchildren. In the end, I nodded, not because I wanted to, but because I was afraid of being seen as a difficult mother, afraid of hurting my son, afraid the whole family would see me as a burden. When the item was taken away, I stood there for a long time. I didn't cry. I just felt empty inside, as if I had personally thrown away a part of myself. And in my mind, a question echoed, one I didn't dare to say out loud at the time. Maybe I really am selfish? After the family heirloom was sold, I thought I had endured enough, but I was wrong. It didn't stop there. My daughter-in-law began to exhibit unusual symptoms. She often sat blankly on the sofa, one hand pressed to her chest, sighing. At meals, she ate very little. Some days, after only a few bites, she would stand up and say she didn't feel well. When I asked, she shook her head. "I'm fine, Mom. Just tired." That's all. But the sighs became more frequent. Late at night, I heard her crying softly in her room, not loudly, but enough for someone else to notice. One evening, my son rushed into my room, his voice filled with anxiety. "Mom, I think my wife might have a health problem." My heart tightened. At this age, just hearing the word health is enough to make you afraid. Eventually, my daughter-in-law spoke. She said the doctor suspected something serious and that more tests were needed. However, their insurance had expired and the costs were very high. She listed the numbers, one by one, clear and cold. I looked at her face. For a very brief moment, her eyes faltered, as if she were hesitating, but only for an instant. Right after that, she cried harder, her voice shaking more. I didn't think for long. I only thought that if it really was an illness, it couldn't wait. The next day, I went to the bank. I stood at the withdrawal counter, my hands shaking so badly that I had to hold on to the edge. The teller asked if I needed to sit down. I shook my head. In my mind, I told myself, money can be earned again. A life cannot. I withdrew money from my last savings, the money I had planned to keep for illness for when I might need care. When I held the stack of cash in my hands, I felt lighter. Lighter because I believed I had done the right thing. When I handed the money to my daughter-in-law, she hugged me very tightly. I felt a brief pause in that embrace. Very brief. Then she thanked me over and over so much that I couldn't even respond. My son stood there. He looked at the money, then at me. He knew. I was sure he knew. But he said nothing. He turned away and said he would take his wife to the doctor right away. In the days that followed, my daughter-in-law often left the house early and came back late. She talked about hospitals, about tests, about serious doctors. I listened and nodded. I worried. I couldn't sleep. Sometimes I even prayed that she would be okay. Then one afternoon, I ran into someone I knew at the market. She looked at me, hesitated for a moment, then said, "I saw your daughter-in-law at a cosmetic clinic last week." I forced a smile. I said she must be mistaken. But when I got home, I paid closer attention. My daughter-in-law's face looked different. Her nose was higher, her skin looked tighter. That evening, I asked her about it. She was silent for a few seconds. Then she spoke very quickly. "I just had a little work done. I needed more confidence, not a single apology. No explanation was given about the money." I looked at my son. He lowered his head. He had known from the beginning. He had known. In that moment, I understood. It wasn't about the money. It was that my compassion had been used as a tool. I didn't yell. I just felt tired. And in my heart, one sentence rang very clearly. I'd rather suffer a loss myself than see my child suffer. But at that very moment, I began to ask myself, how much longer do I have to endure this? That night, I couldn't sleep. Close to midnight, I went downstairs to the kitchen to get some water. The house was tranquil. I walked softly, afraid of waking the children. As I turned back, I heard low voices in the backyard. It was my son and my daughter-in-law. I stopped by the door frame without turning on the light. Not out of curiosity, but because their voices made it impossible for me to move on. My daughter-in-law spoke first, her tone calm, nothing like the tears she had shed in front of me. "Just a little more time. Let her get used to relying on us." My son asked quietly, "And after that?" "Then we find a nursing home, a bit far from the city. Cheap." My heart sank. I thought of small rooms, beds lined up close together. I thought of waking up in the morning with no one calling my name. No one was asking how I was feeling, whether I'd eaten yet. I heard my daughter-in-law continue as if calculating, "Sell this house. The price should be decent." There was a pause. I stood perfectly still. I waited. I hoped. Then my son's voice came, very clear, without hesitation. "Yeah, she's lived long enough." I didn't cry. I didn't tremble either. I only felt an emptiness in my chest, as if a door had just quietly closed. No noise, no sharp pain, just numbness. And in that very moment, a thought appeared in my mind with absolute clarity. If I don't protect myself, no one else will. That night, I lay staring at the ceiling for a long time. I thought about the words I had just overheard. I thought about this house. I thought about my son, the little boy who used to be afraid of the dark, who used to hold my hand and never let go. And I wondered, if I did something to protect myself, would he hate me for it? That question repeated itself in my mind, slowly but relentlessly. At this age, people are no longer as afraid of losing money as they are of losing people. I wasn't afraid of being poor. I was afraid of being left behind, of being treated as someone unnecessary. Then I thought about the image of a nursing home, an unfamiliar room, a name no one ever called, and I understood that if I stayed silent any longer, I would be pushing myself there. The next morning, I searched through a drawer for an old wallet. Inside was a faded business card. It belonged to my family's former lawyer, the one who had assisted my husband with the paperwork for the house and land. I held the card for a long time before making the call. I didn't cry, I didn't complain. I simply said, "I want to know how I can protect myself." He listened very carefully. When I finished, he was silent for a moment, then spoke plainly. "What you're planning to do won't be easy. If your children find out early, they may react very strongly. They might even file a lawsuit against you." I asked, "Do I have a guaranteed chance of winning?" He shook his head. "I can't promise that. The law doesn't always stand on the side of the weaker person." That answer didn't frighten me. On the contrary, it cleared my mind. I didn't need a promise of victory or defeat. I just needed to know that I still had a choice. I told him, "I don't want to win against anyone. I just want peace. I want to live out the rest of my life without waking up every morning in fear." He said softly, "Then we'll take it step by step, slowly but securely." After I hung up, I sat by the window for a long time. Morning sunlight filled the room. Everything looked the same, but inside me, something had changed. I was still afraid. I was still worried that my son would be angry. But for the first time in months, I thought of myself first, not out of selfishness, but because I understood that if I didn't stand up for myself, no one else would do it for me. From that day on, I began to live as if nothing had happened. I still woke up early to cook. I still asked my son what time he was going to work. I still listened to my daughter-in-law talk about the children's school. To anyone looking in from the outside, it was a typical family, perhaps even more peaceful than before. Dinner after dinner passed in a strangely quiet atmosphere. My daughter-in-law served me food with a gentle smile. "Eat more, Mom, so you'll stay healthy." My son looked at me, his voice softer. "You look tired lately, Mom. Don't worry about anything, we've got it covered." I nodded. I smiled. I said, "Okay." But inside, every one of those words carried weight. Not because of love, but because I knew that behind them was a plan they thought I knew nothing about. Some nights after everyone had gone to sleep, I lay staring at the ceiling, wondering what I was doing. I hated this feeling, hated pretending, hated staying silent while my head was full of thoughts. I wasn't someone used to scheming. I had lived my whole life being straightforward, saying what I thought, and yet now I had to learn how to keep my words locked inside. During the day, I took advantage of any chance to go out. I went to the lawyer's office, always alone. He explained each step to me, slowly, clearly, about asset protection trusts, about setting conditions, about the possibility that my children might react violently when they learn the truth. He said, "You have to be mentally prepared. When everything comes out, no one will be happy." I nodded. I didn't expect anyone to be happy. I just hoped I wouldn't be pushed out of my own life. I began to keep documents, receipts, messages, words that I had previously ignored. I didn't keep records to accuse anyone. I kept them because I was afraid that one day I might begin to doubt myself. At some dinners, my daughter-in-law spoke sweetly. "If you move into a nursing home, you'll feel so much lighter. They take care of you all day there." I set my bowl down, my heart racing, but I only said, "Okay, I'll think about it." I saw her eyes light up, very briefly, but I saw it. One night, I almost gave up. That day, my son stayed and talked with me longer than usual. He told me about work pressure, about money, about the children. His voice was tired, just like it used to be whenever he came home asking me for help with something. I listened, and my heart softened. When he said, "If you weren't here anymore, we'd be very sad too." I almost told him everything, almost told him that I knew it all, almost asked him why he was doing this to me. That night, I lay facing the wall and cried very quietly. No one heard me. I asked myself whether I was going too far, whether I was tearing the family apart because of my own fear. Then I remembered the words spoken in the dark. "She's lived long enough." Those words pulled me back to reality. I wasn't doing this to punish anyone. I was doing it because if I didn't, I would disappear quietly without anyone noticing. In the days that followed, I continued to feign agreement. I also said I should consider old age. I asked my daughter-in-law about places that care for the elderly. I listened very carefully so they would believe I had given in. My daughter-in-law grew more relaxed. She talked more openly about plans. My son looked visibly relieved. They thought I had accepted it. Sometimes I was so afraid that my hands would turn cold, afraid they would find out, afraid of a look held for too long, afraid of a sudden question, but I kept going. Not because I was stronger than anyone else, but because I understood that this was the only time I could protect myself. I wasn't scheming. I wasn't calculating. I was just an old mother who learned too late how to hold on to her own life. That morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was still quiet. My son and daughter-in-law were not awake yet. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table. My hands slightly trembling, but my mind very clear. I didn't feel as nervous as I had expected. I just felt tired of having to go this far. Around 9 o'clock, they began to get ready. My daughter-in-law dressed neatly, smiling and chatting more than usual. My son walked back and forth, constantly checking the time. They believed that today was the day everything would end the way they wanted. When it was time, I didn't open the door right away. The doorbell rang, then knocking. I clearly heard my daughter-in-law's voice outside growing sharp. My son called for me, his voice urgent. I stood still, took one deep breath, then opened the back door. The lawyer entered first. He nodded to me. My son and daughter-in-law turned around, stunned. They didn't understand what was happening. I spoke very slowly, very clearly. "Sit down. Today is not for signing papers like you think." The lawyer placed the file on the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone. He simply read through each clause, each document, about the house, about ownership, about how everything had been legally protected. My daughter-in-law reacted first. She said I had been manipulated, said I didn't trust my family, said I was overreacting. My son collapsed into a chair. His face went pale. His hands shook. He looked at me as if seeing a stranger for the first time. "Mom, what are you doing?" I looked at my child, not angry, not triumphant. I only felt a vast emptiness between us. "I'm not doing anything to you," I said. "I'm just not letting anyone take away the rest of my life." The lawyer played the recording. It didn't need to be played in full. Just the first few sentences were enough. The room fell utterly silent. My son lowered his head. His shoulders shook. He cried, honestly cried, not because of losing the house, but because, for the first time, he understood that I had heard everything. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel like I had won. I only felt a burden being lifted. I said the final sentence of that morning. "I'm not kicking anyone out. I'm setting boundaries. From now on, anyone who stays here must respect me. If not, they leave." No one answered. I stood up and walked back to my room. My back ached slightly. My legs felt heavy. I wasn't happy. I was just tired. But for the first time in a very long while, I no longer felt small in my own home. The days that followed were heavy. My son tried to talk to me many times. Sometimes he stood outside my door for a long time before knocking. When I opened it, his eyes were red, his voice hoarse. "Mom, can you give me one more chance? I was wrong. I truly didn't think things would go this far." I listened. I sat down. I let him say everything. He talked about pressure, about money, about being pulled along by his wife. He cried, unable to hold it back. I knew that some of it was real, but I also knew that mistakes don't begin in a single day. I looked at my child, tears falling very slowly. "I don't hate you," I said, "but I can't keep living the way I did these past months." He said he would change, said he would move out for a while, said he would take better care of me if I let them stay. I shook my head. "I already gave you chances," I said, my voice trembling. "Every time I stayed silent, every time I gave in, that was a chance." He lowered his head. He couldn't argue anymore. I didn't force them out immediately. I gave them time to make arrangements. I didn't curse, didn't list sacrifices, didn't bring up past mistakes in front of the children. I simply kept my distance. The most challenging decision was regarding the purchase of the house. I thought about it for a long time. If I left it to my son, I knew everything would repeat itself, not because he was evil, but because he wasn't strong enough to resist being led by greed. I decided to leave the house to my 2 grandchildren, with conditions. Only when they grow up, when they are old enough to understand what respect and responsibility truly mean. I made that clear to the lawyer. I also made it clear to my son. He stayed silent for a long time. Then he nodded. Maybe he was angry, maybe he was disappointed, but for the first time, I saw that he didn't argue. That evening, I sat alone in the living room. The house was quieter than before. There were no more whispers, no more feeling of being watched. I thought about the word forgiveness, the way I had lived by it my entire life, and I understood something very late. Forgiveness does not mean allowing others to keep hurting you. Forgiveness means knowing when to stop so that no one is destroyed any further, neither yourself nor your child. I cried, but they were the clearest, most conscious tears I had shed in many years. In the days after everything settled down, the house returned to quiet, but in a very different way. On the first night alone, I startled awake at a slight sound on the porch. It was just a tree branch brushing against the window. Still, my heart raced, as if I had grown used to always being on guard. I sat up for a long time, listening, and then I realized there was no longer anyone who could hurt me in this house. Some evenings, I picked up my phone only to set it down again. Sometimes I walked toward the door, my hand resting on the latch, an image appearing in my mind of my son standing on the porch like before. I wondered if opening the door would make everything return to the way it was. Then I stopped. Not because I loved him any less, but because I understood that love does not mean returning to suffering. I began to fix up the house again, not in a hurry, not with much money. I hung the old photos back up, bought a few new plants, replaced the faded curtains. Each small change made me feel like I was coming back to life, slowly but steadily. One night, I sat alone in the living room and played an old piece of music my husband used to love. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to create a warm atmosphere in the house. I closed my eyes. I didn't cry. I felt my heart soften. I met up with friends my age again. We talked about our children, about the past. One woman was quiet for a long time before saying, "I wish I had the courage to do what you did." I shook my head. I wasn't brave. I just had no way left to retreat. From time to time, my son calls. I answer, I don't avoid him, but I don't say much. We are learning to talk again from the beginning, slowly, more carefully. There are silences, and I accept them. I understand that not every crack can heal right away. Some need time. Some will remain forever, just to remind us. I no longer try to be the mother who sacrifices everything. I am learning to be a mother who still loves her child, but also knows how to love herself. Family to me now is not a place where you endure pain to keep the peace. Family is a place with boundaries, with respect, with genuine kindness. I lost many things during those 3 months, possessions, memories, trust, but I also found something more important, the right to live in peace within my own life. And if someone were to ask me now whether I regret it, I would answer honestly, I didn't lose my family. I simply learned how to love the right way.